agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. With me today is political and policy analyst Kristen Matheny. Hey, Kristen.
Hi, Mike. How are you?
I am doing okay today. How about you?
I'm also okay.
Okay. Before we get to what will obviously be our top story, I know listeners probably realize that we are back to our old theme, love the government, and there were some issues with rights and so forth, and thankfully we were able to work everything out, or almost work everything out. I still have to sign a few things in here and there, but in the interim, they have agreed to let us use the song. And, even though our new agreement doesn't require us to mention the artist, I want to because they've been great. Old Papa Giraffe, and just want to give them a shout out and encourage people to check out the full version of Love the Government and all their other stuff on the Free Music Archive. And we will also put a link in the show notes. So thank you guys for that. Also, thanks to everyone who's been helping us out by not fast forwarding through our sponsor ads, as well as checking out our sponsors, because that support shows up in our stats that our sponsors track, and that makes it easier for us to keep finding the sponsorships we need to keep the show going. And, of course, for people, if you're vehemently anti-ad, well, all of our Patreon supporters get completely ad-free versions of every episode we do. And to find out more about all the Patreon stuff, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. And with that out of the way, Kristen, so what are we leading with today, as if I didn't know?
Surprise. Yeah. It's the impeachment, the impeachment trial. So just a quick update, because, there's been a lot this week, just like there was last week. And there's been a lot in the last 24 hours. So I'll just do some of the more recent updates. So this past Friday, which was yesterday, if you're listening on Saturday, Republicans in the Senate were able to grab enough votes to reject the call for new witnesses in the presidential impeachment trial. As expected, Democrats commented that this was a sad day and decried the failure of the motion. And Republicans said that this had been an attempt by Democrats to extend the trial and that things needed to be wrapped up. So this kind of went according to what most of us were thinking and about how it would go. And then this weekend, the Senate is adjourned, so not much going on today or tomorrow, obviously. And the closing arguments and the speeches will take place on Monday. The final vote, or I should say votes on the articles of impeachment, are scheduled for Wednesday. And I just wanted to quickly point out that there are two really big events happening before that, which may have been part of this deal brokered between Republicans and Democrats to push those votes to Wednesday. And that's the Iowa caucus, and we'll talk more about that later, but that's Monday, February 3rd. And the State of the Union is Tuesday, February 4th. So it's going to be a jam-packed week.
No kidding. No kidding.
So that's sort of where we are. I don't know about you. I had just gotten home from work and I was, trying to unwind or whatever. And I ran into the other room to watch on TV the vote. But I think we all kind of knew how it would go. I'm sure you felt the same way.
Well, on that vote, so Democrats were hoping that they'd get the 4 Republicans they needed to call witnesses, especially John Bolton. And of course, those 4 Republicans were Mitt Romney and Susan Collins, who did in fact vote that way, and then retiring Lamar Alexander and Lisa Murkowski. Now, I think that Alexander's and Murkowski's rationales are worth talking about, for voting against it, at least a little bit. And what Alexander basically said is he sort of conceded that, yes, whatever Bolton said is right, but it doesn't matter because it's not impeachable. So he basically said, what's the point? If I am willing to accept what the witness said, why would I need to hear from the witness? And Murkowski said, well, this is there's no way there's going to be a fair trial here, and having witnesses or not isn't going to change anything, so I'm voting against it. And, it's sort of hard to argue with those two things. I mean, I'm maybe looking at it as not a fair trial in a different way than Murkowski is, but I can't say that those are ridiculous motives for voting against witnesses, actually.
Mhm.
So that was by far one of the lesser ridiculous things that happened this week. Now, for the height of ridiculousness, I would refer people to Alan Dershowitz, who I don't
knew
know.
you were going to say that. I
I
knew
don't know
it.
what happened to him, some sort of traumatic brain injury or something. But yeah, the Dershowitz claim, where he went way out there to not just say, right, that, well, even if he did it, it's not impeachable, but no, to say that as long as the president just thinks that his being reelected would be a good thing, then he can do anything that's not an actual crime and it's not impeachable. And that was like, well, okay, wow, what bizarro world did you bring that in from? So anyway, those are my two comments about what happened this week, and I'm wondering what you think about those two things, Kristen.
Well, so yesterday, I think all of us were sort of waiting because there were the big four. How are these big four Republicans going to vote? And I think Democrats were eyeing the four of them and, kind of hoping that they would, I guess, vote in favor of witnesses. And it's funny because there are actually a lot of Republicans, maybe not necessarily lawmakers, but pundits who were saying, like, for example, I listened to the Ben Shapiro podcast, and he was actually arguing for introducing witnesses for probably very Democratic Party reasons. But, he was arguing for witnesses. He put forth a pretty compelling argument. And I think I got the impression that a lot of the waffling on the part of these four Democrats was political. I think it's funny because the one that actually struck me as really interesting was Susan Collins, believe it or not, because I figured she would vote to hear from the witnesses. But she comes from a heavily sort of liberal leaning. She comes from Maine. Her district is fairly liberal leaning. She's got her eye on 2020. She wants to be eventually reelected. And I think, once Lamar Alexander kind of came out in front and said that he was going to vote against witnesses, and once Mitt Romney came out and said he was going to vote for witnesses, I think she kind of threw her hat in the ring for political reasons. I thought her response was the shortest of all of those responses. I think she kind of took the high road politically, knowing that it wouldn't really matter what she said because we weren't going to hear from witnesses anyway. Yeah. In terms of Lamar Alexander and Lisa Murkowski, what they said, I pay more attention to what Lamar Alexander said because I think a lot of it seemed true to me. Yes, he did these things. Yes, they were probably ethically questionable, to say the least, or the most, depending on how you look at it. However, does it rise to the level of being impeached? And probably not. The issue I had with what Lamar Alexander said was that he wasn't actually addressing the vote on the witnesses. He was talking more about why he thinks the president shouldn't be impeached. Mm-hmm. He talked about the president, the way we would solve this is the 2020 election would be a referendum on President Trump. And I like this argument. I personally take this stance when it comes to this whole trial that really all of this shouldn't be solved in an impeachment trial. This should all come down to 2020. If you don't like the president, you should elect him out, get him right out of office and elect somebody else, somebody that you think is better. In terms of the Alan Dershowitz thing, it's funny because I watched this. So I've always had a lot of respect for Alan Dershowitz. I've always thought
I used to.
Yeah, I know a lot of Democrats who say that, and I know a lot of Republicans who couldn't stand him for years and years, and now this is how politics are. I've become so jaded by it, but I've always had a lot of respect for him. He's always been somebody that I respected, even though I didn't always agree with him, and I think that he made some statements that were confusing, to say the least. I think what interested me more was the reaction to it. I think that there were Democrats who were kind of setting up this straw man argument. Not all of them, but particularly I'm thinking of Adam Schiff, and he was setting up the strong man argument, saying, well, he was arguing this. He was saying that nothing that the president does is impeachable. But then you had Republicans who were sort of like twisting what Dershowitz said in their direction too. And I thought it was interesting that there was punditry back and forth, but there was no focus on what Alan Dershowitz actually said. So I guess that was kind of a highlight of what happened with Dershowitz this week.
But what he actually said was just flies in the face of I would say, any reasonable interpretation of the Constitution and what the framers had in mind. And certainly it flies in the face of what what almost every constitutional expert on both sides of the aisle has concluded up until this point. But it was just an extreme argument to kind of throw out there. And so that way, I think it gave Republicans even more cover. Not that they needed it, because they had the, wrongdoing, but not impeachable sort of thing. So, and, I certainly would have voted for hearing testimony, simply because even though I agree with both Murkowski and Collins on their rationales, this, as a lot of people have said, this isn't just about a vote in the Senate. This is about getting out information to the American people. And this was a big platform for that. And so I can understand why Republicans wouldn't want John Bolton to have that platform to say damaging things about what the president did. And so that's what Republicans chose to do. And maybe even strategically, it works better for Democrats in one sense, because now they can plausibly say, well, this is at least in part a cover-up, an unfair trial, when it would have been harder for them to say that had there been witnesses called and cross-examined.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I agree with you to some extent, and I disagree. I kind of just feel like the ball had been dropped by Democrats, especially this week more than last week. I feel like I kept waiting for something, not with any sense of hope, but just, Adam Schiff kept now I'm thinking about this. This is going to sound strange. I'm thinking about this like as if I was a Democrat. If I was a Democrat, I'd be watching this and I'd be saying, okay, they keep saying that they have the evidence. Well, if they have the evidence, then why do they need the witnesses? And so, I guess the most confusing thing for me this week is that if I were a Democrat, I'd be upset with people like Adam Schiff and Jerry Nadler, because if they had sort of done their due diligence in the beginning and they'd done their job, I feel like none of this would have been an issue. I mean, if they hadn't sort of rammed this through, there might have been an opportunity to adjudicate the subpoena of Bolton, for example. There were some other like procedural issues. And so, I really tried this week to put myself in Democrat shoes and say, if I were a Democrat, this would infuriate me. This process would really infuriate me, and not, because it's an emotional process, but because procedurally the ball was just dropped.
Well, for the last week, I've been like a lot of people suffering from impeachment fatigue. How could you not?
Too. Oh my gosh! Yes.
When I was preparing for the show today, I was in the last couple of days. It's really just I've been obsessing over what can I say, and how can we approach this in a way that just doesn't repeat what everyone has been saying everywhere else. And it got into my head in the worst way. It affected my workout and just everything. It was just like, it became that thing. And what I thought about is related to a comment that a listener made last week. He accused me of Trump derangement syndrome, and based on last week's episode. And I thought about that because I think it's important to take, to at least consider criticisms. And
I agree.
And I said last week that I would vote to convict and remove the president. But I realized that, I was prejudging because I said that before I even heard the president's defense. Now, of course, most of us are guilty of some degree of motivated reasoning on this and almost every other issue, right? We start with our preferred conclusion or outcome, and then we work backward to find the evidence, the arguments.
Confirmation bias.
There you go.
The cornerstone of psychology.
And so what I thought I would do this week is really challenge myself on this. I wanted to go at things the opposite way. And what I mean by that is I wanted to start with some basic principles concerning impeachment. I mean, principles that would apply no matter who the president was or what I thought of him or her. And then from there, I could reason my way forward and not, backward from this predetermined preferred conclusion. And I just said to myself, I wonder where this is going to take me. And so Are you willing to go on this journey with me here, Kristen?
Me? Yeah.
Okay. So
yeah.
I found some things that really kind of surprised me. But before I do that, I just want to thank our two sponsors for today. The first one is Empower. And if you're interested in saving a lot more in 2020, the Empower app can help make that a reality. With Empower, saving and managing your money couldn't be easier. Their set it and forget it autosave function lets you put in your weekly savings target, and then every day Empower studies your income and spending and automatically moves the right amount of money into your savings account where you're going to be less likely to spend it. And in addition to that, Empower can actually negotiate your phone and cable bills for you. Very cool. And they've also got real live human being coaches not chatbots, real people you can text for individualized recommendations. So if you want to save big this year, download Empower. That's EMPOWER in the App Store or Play Store. I did, and over 650,000 other people have too. And even better, Politics Guys listeners, you get $5 when you use offer code Politics Guys and reach your savings goal. Visit empower.me/Politics Guys for more details. And our second sponsor, SaneBox. I've mentioned them before because what SaneBox did to my disaster zone of an inbox was nothing short of amazing. As your email comes in, SaneBox's AI keeps only the important messages in your inbox and directs those other distracting and much less important messages to your Sane Later folder, which means you immediately know what you need to pay attention to right now and what can wait. And it also has a bunch of other great features like Sane Black Hole, where you can put messages from annoying senders you never want to hear from again, and Sane Reminders, this incredibly useful feature that lets you know if someone hasn't replied to your email by a certain date. And best of all, you can use SaneBox with any email client or phone anywhere you check your email. So check out how SaneBox can magically remove distractions from your inbox with a free 2-week trial. Visit sanebox.com/politicsguys today to start your free trial and get a $25 credit. That's sanebox.com/politicsguys. Okay, so Kristen, here's the thing. I started with the purpose of presidential impeachment.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, the purpose of presidential impeachment, based on all of my research and understanding of it, is that it's when the president does something so egregiously wrong that it necessitates overturning the will of the people, and that is that the president serve, of course, for a full 4 years they elected him to, by not just removing him from office, but also by banning him from ever holding federal office again. And of course, that's also anti-democratic because it prevents the people from exercising their will to choose him again, or, not just for the presidency, but for any other federal office, right? And the framers list 2 specific crimes that would qualify, treason and bribery, but they clearly realized there could be other things that would rise to that level, including things there might not be a specific law prohibiting. So Alan Dershowitz is wrong on that. That's what high crimes and misdemeanors means, and everyone knows it, who's not just, in the bag for the president. So this is, the historical record bears this out. Constitutional scholars bears. There's really no question about that. In fact, it was even the view of most congressional Republicans, back when President Clinton was impeached. So that's what we know about what impeachment is for and what qualifies. So would you agree with me to this point?
Yes,
Okay.
Yes, I would.
Okay. So it seems to me that the House has 2 main roles in this process. Number 1, they investigate potential wrongdoing. And number 2, they approve articles of impeachment for referral to the Senate if they find it appropriate. That's pretty straightforward, and you wouldn't disagree with that, I'm sure.
No.
Now, the Senate's 2 main roles here are, number 1, to determine whether the president's guilty of the offenses that are specified in the articles of impeachment, and only those offenses, because that's what's before them. And number 2, if he is guilty, to determine whether those offenses are so egregious that they justify overturning the will of the people. So far,
that's the tricky part.
Oh yeah, that's definitely the trickier part.
Yeah.
So that to me was the groundwork, the foundational stuff. And then I turned to President Trump's case. And those 2 articles, abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. Now, on abuse of power, I think it just boggles the imagination to not accept the argument that the president's phone call was somehow perfect or that he did nothing wrong. That's a ridiculous argument to me. And Donald Trump, of course, can make, because he never admits being wrong about anything, but that argument just doesn't pass the sniff test, the smell test, whatever, that test, right? Because even as Lamar Alexander said, there's just a mountain of evidence that says that the president did something wrong here. And so he's guilty of some abuse of his power. You with me to this point?
I am.
Okay. Obstruction of Congress. Now, Donald Trump basically said, without invoking executive privilege, he said, no one talk. And a blanket refusal to release any testimony, any documents, or allow any testimony, that is obstruction of Congress, because there's no claim of executive privilege that's been made. And even if one were made, the courts have for a long time now held that privilege does not extend to covering up crimes. And it also can't be asserted as a blanket immunity from any sort of testimony or document release. So to me, there's no question that President Trump is guilty of obstructing Congress. What do you think about that?
I take issue with that.
Okay.
I think that we're overlooking a really powerful point that was made a couple of weeks ago, and I feel like it's sort of drifted out of favor in the media. But Republicans were making an argument that he's well within his constitutional right to do just that. He can bar witnesses. And I think that what you're talking about... Oh, go ahead.
I'm saying on that question, on what grounds? Because he hasn't asserted executive privilege, and so...
No, he hasn't.
And so
he hasn't.
What's his authority to bar all witnesses and all testimony?
Well, it would be executive privilege, which is where I think the problem comes in. I mean, he's well within his constitutional right to do it, but he would have to invoke executive privilege in order to do it. And I think what the question is, because this is not the first time something like this has happened, is how do we go about, how do we manage this from here on out? But I don't know. This is something that was argued a few weeks ago when this was going through the House, and I just feel like witness after witness after witness. We had 17 witnesses come up, and all of that was admitted as evidence in the Senate trial, and all of this just felt to me like the House had these witnesses, they weren't able to make their case sufficiently, and then they sort of pushed it along to the Senate to try to well, then you see what you can do with it. It just felt very rushed and unprepared, and I think this was one of those arguments that to me felt a little rushed and unprepared too.
Okay, well, on that actually ties into something I wanted to also mention, is that it's a lot, because I said that the Senate has two roles here, right? The first is to say, well, is the president guilty of these charges? And to me, the answer to both of those is no question, the case is pretty clear. But then the next question, the second part of the Senate's job is, do they rise to the level of impeachable offenses? That's the first question.
The tricky part.
That was the easy one. The first one was the easy one to me. Yeah. But so when I thought about this one, I thought, well, I don't know positively that overall case made is strong enough to support a vote to convict. And that's in large part due to the obstruction of Congress, right? Because that's why you obstruct Congress. So the Congress can't make a good enough case. I mean, otherwise, why would you bother to obstruct? But on that obstruction of Congress charge, I also don't feel that the case is strong enough because, and this gets back to your point, the House decided not to attempt to fight the refusals to cooperate.
Yeah,
and
that
in fact,
me.
they didn't even decide to. In fact, they didn't even subpoena these folks. And had they done this and won, and I think they would have won at least in part, then then if those officials and the president had said, no, we're still not going to cooperate, then that's a slam dunk for obstruction. There's no question. That's you couldn't. Alan Dershowitz couldn't argue his way out of that, But that would be the most clear-cut impeachable offense you could possibly find, right? I think you would agree with me on that.
I mean, if he did it the same way he did it the first time around, yes, I think it would be. I think it would rise to the level of obstruction. Yeah.
I mean, if the court said, well,
if he did it,
these people
we're
have
assuming
to
he would do it.
Yeah. Well,
I don't know that he would.
I'm safe to. I feel that's safe to assume. But if the courts would say if the court said, you have to testify and produce these documents, and the president said no, well, there you go. That's pretty straightforward, And so, but given all this,
Mm-hmm.
I went back to President Clinton's impeachment and Senate trial.
Yeah, I did too.
Yeah, okay, there you go. Republican Senator Arlen Specter, he voted on President Clinton's impeachment. His vote was not proved, therefore not guilty. And in the end, that's how I would vote. Now, I'd also release a statement along with my vote, strongly urging the House to continue its investigation, including strongly urging them to subpoena John Bolton, Rudy Giuliani, Mick Mulvaney, Rick Perry, and President Trump. This idea that, well, why should we even bother to subpoena President Trump? Because the Democrats say, well, because he's just going to lie, or the Republicans say, well, because it's a witch hunt. Well, presidents have been subpoenaed in the past, and no one even considered doing that. And that to me is bizarre, that you wouldn't ask the main person here, hey, did you do this? And you can't assert executive privilege to not answer a question about whether or not you committed a crime, because executive privilege doesn't cover that. And if he lies about it, then boom, you have a case for perjury. So I get the political calculation here.
Mm-hmm.
House Democrats knew that they wouldn't have time to build a rock solid case against President Trump. I mean, even if you assume quick resolution of all the legal challenges to subpoenas they might have issued, we're talking probably I would guess articles of impeachment wouldn't have been ready until summer, maybe, right before the election.
Yeah.
And then at that point, let's let the people decide in a few months argument becomes so strong that I don't think it matters necessarily. You still wouldn't get the vote, possibly, though I think that's a much weaker argument, because with impeachment, of course, and removal, it's not just removal, it's you can't stand for any federal office again. And that to me is pretty important. And this is where, you mentioned me being disappointed with Democrats. Yeah, I am. Because if the only concern of Democrats was to fight egregious presidential abuse of power and egregious obstruction, two things that I think absolutely are the case, and if they really cared first and foremost about protecting our institutions, then they would have taken the time to thoroughly make that case, even if it meant investigating into late 2020, up until January 2021, when I hope, Joe Biden or someone else will be taking the oath. Because these things take a long time. If you want to do it right, you can't rush it, especially in the face of just, such fierce resistance from a president who I feel is just thoroughly corrupt. And so basically, I think what happened here is the Ukraine phone call just sort of fell into Democrats' laps a little too late in the game for them to develop that strongest possible case without potentially, they felt, jeopardizing their electoral goals in 2020. So bottom line for me is that a number of congressional Democrats decided to put party before country. And that's incredibly disappointing to me. I would have liked to have seen the most compelling case made to impeach and remove a man who I believe to be certainly the most corrupt president in my lifetime. And that didn't happen. And that, I think, is a tragedy. But that's, of course, exactly what Republicans are doing as well, putting party before country, though I'd argue they're doing it in a far more destructive manner, because instead of not working as hard as they possibly could to remove this corrupt man from office, they're actively supporting him because they like some policy goals. So there you go. And now, but that leaves me thinking, well, I don't think it's because Democrats or Republicans are unusually in Congress right now are unusually corrupt or craven or anything like that. To me, it's the nature of the system that we have and the incentives in the system, because we have a political environment that has taken party loyalty and elevated it above almost every single other thing. We have this electoral system that basically selects for and rewards people who can raise a lot of money for their party, who are fiercely loyal to their party, and who just play to those most destructive, partisan, disruptive, voters in the base. And as long as we have that system, expecting we're going to have that structure in place and that reward system, and that we're going to get different politicians is just nuts, And so that brings me back to the need for not just, blaming the other side and screaming and yelling, but to say, well, what is it about this system that we have that is giving us these results, and how can we change it? And this brings me right back, of course, to the plug for the book that Will and I are doing, because that's the whole point. That's the whole reason we're doing this book about, about taking a strong look at our system and understanding, well, if you have a system like this and you have a media environment like this is what you're going to get. And blaming the people, it's like blaming your dog if he poops on the rug. Hey, train your dog better, So that's where we're at, I think, with this. So that's my take.
So I obviously have a different take, but I guess where I would begin is a kind of, I have to go on a little bit of a fiery rant here. So one of the, in preparing for this show and preparing the introduction, I was, I have to sort of get out of my head as a Republican and as somebody who's a Trump supporter. But, with that being said, I'm not necessarily, I'm not beholden necessarily to always supporting Trump. It's, there are certainly been things that he's done that I disagree with. To many of your points, I think that Lamar Alexander's explanation of why he decided to vote yesterday the way he did, I thought kind of summed up what a lot of rational people believe on the right and the left, is that did something happen that was wrong? Yes. Did it rise to the level of, being impeached? No, we probably need to get this over with. I think there are a lot of compelling arguments to hear witnesses. I think there are some compelling arguments not to hear witnesses, but I think there are more compelling arguments to hear witnesses. And I think there were some people on the right who made those arguments very well. I think Susan Collins was the senator who made a comment that we should allow for limited witnesses on both sides. And I thought, maybe that was smart because it would sort of limit the amount of time that this would drag on. And I think anyway, back to my fiery rant. So one of the things that really frustrated me with preparing for this show and with preparing for other shows where we've talked about impeachment is how hard it is to find an accurate timeline that doesn't contain opinions and punditry, and how hard it is to find like real journalism about a topic as divisive as this. And I think it speaks, it's probably, there are a lot of things that frustrate me, but this is probably the thing about politics that frustrates me the most, is just the blatant divisiveness and these partisan hacks who kind of get out there, policymakers and journalists too, who claim to be, sort of delivering the news or delivering the facts on either side. This goes equally for Republicans and Democrats, and they're just sort of casting everything in this particular light. And this is what we're digesting as the American people. We're digesting this partisanship, and I think it also goes to the point that if you get out and you actually talk to people like what we're doing now, and obviously with your book and everything else, when you get out and you talk to people and you kind of put all of that aside and you talk to a person like a person and you treat a person with, a basic level of respect, you can actually move mountains. You can actually talk to people and understand where people are coming from, and you can disagree, and that's okay. And I think we've really lost that. So in preparing for this show, I think I was trying to get dates for things, just dates. And just to get that, I think it took me like 15 minutes to find an article. I don't even remember where I found some of the information, but I just wanted to get a timeline of what happened so it was accurate, just to back up, what I was thinking had happened. And it was unbelievably frustrating for me. And it's, again, I've made this point on the show before, but the bias is so rampant. It's getting to the point now where and I feel like every time something comes up about Donald Trump or about Republicans versus Democrats or 2020, it's like people get so red in the face and they get so worked up, and you just kind of want to grab whoever you're talking to and say, like, let's talk about this, because it is divisive. But I think this is what's going on in the Senate right now, is we're just so divided, and Americans are watching this on TV. They're seeing this, and I just don't think there's an end to this, which is depressing. I hope there's an end. I want to believe there's an end, but this is really all about 2020. And this is all about, in the end, this is all about politics. And I do think that both Republicans and Democrats, to your point again, I think that both Republicans and Democrats have put party over I guess, integrity, doing the will of the people, doing what they're supposed to, doing their jobs. I mean, I've made so many comments over the last couple of weeks to my husband that I can't remember the last time I saw Congress work this hard. The last time I saw the Senate work this hard. And to me, that's really depressing that it was over something this divisive and this political. And we knew the outcome. I mean, the outcome, I guess, hasn't really happened yet. It'll happen Wednesday. But we all sort of, I think all signs are leading to an acquittal. And then this may come up again, and we may see another, we may have to go through this again. And it's just, I don't know, the whole thing. No wonder we have impeachment fatigue syndrome. I mean, really.
I'm disgusted. And, I think it was at the beginning of the trial when John Roberts made that comment about, watch what you're saying. This is, remember, you're in the world's greatest deliberative body, and it's hard not to.
I know.
Yeah, so sad, so sad. I think that's we can agree on that. No matter which side you come down on, that our institutions just seem to regularly fail us, and that's just it. Anyway, let's. What do you say we move on before I get too depressed?
Let's move on to something I don't know, less depressing. So we're going to talk
about, at least,
yeah, for you. For me, I'm just kind of ambivalent about it, but I still find it extraordinarily interesting. So we're going to talk about the Iowa caucuses next. So this is all going to go down on Monday. The Iowa caucuses are right around the corner, and Democrats across the state will gather to choose their candidates. And this is sort of the first step of many steps. There are many, many steps towards choosing a party nominee for 2020. So this is kind of the first step. And there are, though, many issues that are sort of brewing and that are surrounding the caucuses right now. There are issues with the Iowa caucuses in general. I'm sure we'll get into that. But there are also many issues this year in particular. And one of these issues is an allegation that's starting to pick up some steam that there's a Stop Bernie movement. So I was interested to hear your opinion on that. And that's something that's sort of developing within the Democratic Party. And I know a lot of Bernie supporters are very upset about that. They feel like he was, he was overlooked. And, that's a too kind a word, but they feel like he was overlooked in 2016. So, I'm not surprised that this is coming out again in 2020. So, yeah, that's what's going on. And that's this week. So all eyes will be on Iowa. And just as a side note, every 4 years, I do a little Googling about the Iowa caucuses. If you haven't ever Googled how they work, you should, because it's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
I forget how fascinating caucuses are. I mean, they're like these little town hall meetings. It's really crazy.
Yeah. And, on one hand, you can say, well, there are Iowa, there are 49 delegates up for grabs, and that's the winner will get a proportion of those because it's not winner take all.
No.
To win the nomination, you need 1,990 delegates because there are almost 4,000 total delegates. Look at it that way. Say Iowa's like, well, it's the small potatoes, right? But also, research shows that the winner of Iowa tends to get a nice boost further on.
Yeah, it's about momentum, really, is what the Iowa caucuses are about, which is interesting.
But I mean, really, this will give us a much better sense. And of course, we're all excited for the first actual contest, but we're not going to really know where things are until Super Tuesday, when there are just a ton of delegates that are up for grabs, right? And that's, for instance, what we have in, say, California has 415 delegates as compared to Iowa's 40, I say 49, I think I said. So that's a pretty big difference, obviously. And so, but still, you're right. And that Iowa's going to matter. And it looks like right now that Bernie is surging and Biden's a strong second. And then, you have Buttigieg and Warren. But one of the interesting things about Iowa, of course, is that who people are going to choose as their second choice, because for those candidates who don't make the 15% viability, then they go and move over to their second choice person and get their votes. And so, and we'll see how that plays out. But yeah, the interesting thing to me this week has been I wouldn't call it a Stop Bernie movement because we haven't really seen that yet.
I was going to say it's not really there yet, but
no, because I think, a lot of people are concerned. A lot of centrists, there's this centrist Democratic group called Third Way, and they've been pushing this. And some other groups just, basically saying that electing Bernie Sanders would be insane given some of the things he said and all this. And so that's obviously the impetus for this. But they also know that there is a huge enthusiasm gap between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, who's the most likely nominee. And they don't necessarily want to alienate the young, enthusiastic Bernie voters because they don't want them to stay home on election day, certainly. So there are some, competing forces, countervailing forces here. But for me, if you are a progressive, like I know a lot of listeners are, I think you see this as the best chance you may ever get to elect somebody who truly stands with you. I don't think really since the early 1970s, before a lot of our listeners were born, and certainly before, I was politically active in any way, there really hasn't been this kind of potential opportunity for the left. And so, if you're on the left, you say, well, should we just squander this by electing another Wall Street, go along to get along, Clintonian, okay, boomer Republicrat? Or do we actually try to push through some real change? So I get that impetus, so for Bernie, I think what we would have if he ends up winning the election is, I think we get policy results that are just about the same as under Biden or Buttigieg. We'd see liberal judicial nominations. We'd see a lot of deregulation, all that executive action stuff. But it would be at least better in one way for progressives, because then democratic socialism would be normalized in the way that, well, it never has been before in this country. And I think that's a good thing, actually. I think that's a real positive. But of course, if he's that's a big assumption that he can win the presidency, because a lot of things if Bernie's the nominee are going to come up, like, he praised Venezuela's government in the past and said all kinds of stuff that really, while they came out a little bit in 2016, what the Trump campaign would do to these, would do with these things in the general election, go to 270 to win and pull up their presidential election interactive map and look at the states that are being challenged. And you think, well, sure, Bernie's going to play great in California and Oregon and Washington and New York but in Michigan and in Minnesota, I don't think so. I'm not saying that I disagree with a lot of Bernie's positions, though I do in some respects, at least in terms, not necessarily in terms of goals, but in terms of incrementalism, because I'm that weird sort of Burkean liberal, right? But I think it's going to be really tough to defend some of these views. And he's never really had to do this before on that kind of stage. And so that's my concern. My concern is that, I think if he gets elected, I'll be pleased as heck. I'll be proud to say Bernie Sanders is president of the United States.
Oh my gosh.
I'll be happy to say that. I think it'll be good for a lot of reasons. But what I think is going to happen is the first Wednesday in November, I'm going to say to a lot of my progressive friends, God, I told you this was going to happen. And I just don't want to be in that position even a little bit. So that's my take.
So I talked about this in last week's quick take because I made a prediction, and I'll tell you, sometimes I make predictions and they come true, and sometimes I make predictions and they don't come true. This one came true. I knew that this would come back this week, and it'll probably pick up steam as, you get more and more people coming out against Bernie Sanders. And like you said, I don't think it's a movement necessarily. That's a really strong word to use, but that's sort of the way it's being described in the media, that's especially the media that's friendly to him, as this movement against him. And I think in 2016, again, looking at this from a Republican's perspective, in 2016, when he started surging, he was surging in these very specific demographics. And I think it was clear to a lot of us on the right and on the left both that Hillary Clinton was going to take the nomination. And that no matter what Bernie Sanders said or did, I mean, even though there was a small part of me, even though he's probably the candidate I disagree with the most of all the candidates on the left, he's the one that I sometimes feel bad for just as a human being because of what was being done to him a little bit in 2016. I mean, there was, I think, an effort to suppress support for him. And although I still believe that Hillary Clinton would have gotten that nomination just because of the reasons you laid out. You know, you have all these purple states, these sort of, you have like this big, broad swath of these blue collar Democrats, who are, looking for something different. They're not looking for democratic socialism. They're looking for bigger paychecks, lower gas prices. They're not all going to be these, coastal academic types that understand what he's talking about and can see it playing out in theory. They can't visualize that. They're a little more pragmatic. So, I think that in 2020, we're seeing sort of this. I do think there is an effort to stop Bernie, but I think it's for the reasons, again, that you laid out. I think that it's not possible that he will win. I don't think that he's a particularly viable candidate against Donald Trump, who does play well along some of the same demographics. I mean, there was a big argument on the right after 2016 that a lot of the Bernie voters jumped to voting for Trump. And I mean, I don't know of one. Not that I know everybody, but I don't know of one. I think maybe there may have been a few, but I don't know who they are. I don't think it was as big a deal as people made it to be. I've predicted from the beginning that that I thought Biden would be the nominee for those reasons, because he plays well in those purple states. And I also think, and I've said it again on this program before, Obama nostalgia. I think people,
I've got it. Oh my God, I've got super Obama nostalgia.
I know, and you're not the only one. I know I have a lot of Democrat friends who feel this Obama nostalgia, and a lot of them were really frustrated with him when he left office, and they were, frustrated that he didn't sort of socialize healthcare, and he carried on a lot of these Bush era policies. I think I talked about that on the Quick Take last week too. But a lot of them are frustrated, but now they're feeling it in the same way that once Bush left office, I wasn't the biggest Bush supporter in the world, but I supported him. And Obama came in, I had a little bit of Bush nostalgia. I think this is just what happens, and so I that's why I think Biden will likely get the nomination. But yeah, I mean, I think this is interesting. I predicted last week that it was going to get bigger. I think it'll be interesting to watch this. I think Hillary Clinton making statements that are kind of anti-Bernie was funny, I guess, as a Republican. I thought the whole thing was funny.
Yeah. It's hard for me. I'll admit it's hard for me to be at all level-headed when it comes to Hillary Clinton. And that's because, my history with Hillary Clinton, not personally, obviously, dates back a long time. In fact, back when I was a conservative. And so I have a lot of weird emotions about the Clintons. And so I can't even be anywhere close to, fair and objective when it comes to Hillary Clinton. I am longing for a time when I don't hear Clinton and Democratic Party in the same sentence, and maybe that'll happen in my lifetime. I don't know, but that's what I hope. Also on the Biden thing, I think it's interesting that there are a lot of Trump surrogates that are descending upon Iowa in these last days to make the case. They say it's not to argue against Joe Biden, but pretty clearly from their messaging, it's very anti-Biden. In fact, even Rick Scott, your own Florida's Rick Scott, began running television ads in Iowa this week, accusing Biden of corruption. And so, obviously who the Trump campaign doesn't want to be the nominee, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways the polls kind of speak for themselves. But I as a Republican, as somebody who will be supporting Trump in 2020, I wouldn't say that Biden scares me, but he's the one that if one person had the chance to, run a formidable race against Donald Trump and possibly beat him, I think it would be Joe Biden again, for what we were talking about earlier about the swing states and Obama nostalgia. And he represents kind of a, I don't want to say a sunnier time because it's such a weird phrase, but it's kind of a sunnier time for the Democratic Party when things didn't look so bleak and so dark. And, I think a lot of people, again, I don't know a lot of people who have like clearly chosen a Democratic candidate, a lot of Democrats who have chosen somebody. But the few people I know who have chosen Biden, I mean, this is kind of what they lay out for me, because I love asking people, why are you supporting Buttigieg? Why are you supporting Joe Biden? I'm just curious, and a lot of them say that they're like, well, Warren and Sanders are too left wing, and I'm not a socialist. I can't relate to Buttigieg. I had one friend actually tell me that this week, but Biden seems like a solid middle ground. So I guess I'll vote for Biden. And I think this would probably be the rationale of a lot of Democrats who did vote in November 2020, is like, well, I guess I'll vote for Biden, which then begs the question, is that enough?
Yeah. Well, but again, I think on the left, there are a lot of people who feel that a vote for Biden is a wasted opportunity. And I get that. I actually think that Bernie Sanders does stand a chance of winning. I think in our current environment, pretty much anyone who either of the major parties nominates stands at least some chance of winning. But, also in terms of the other thing I wanted to mention, in terms of the campaign to try to stop Bernie Sanders, there's also been some talk among some DNC higher ups that maybe they should revisit their rules that don't allow superdelegates to vote on the first ballot. I don't think it's going to come to anything, but and this is when my kind of radical side comes up. Back in 2016, we were doing the show actually then, and there were times when I would just listen to Bernie and read Bernie, and I would get inspired. I remembered what my younger self was like when I still had ideals and things like that, and wasn't so jaded and so forth. And I got worked up because, and I feel that with Bernie, and I understand folks on the progressive left who are frustrated by a government that seems enthralled to the financial and Wall Street interest. And I agree that that's a huge problem. And so I get that. And there are times when I would like nothing more than to see a fiery progressive as president of the United States. I don't think it's going to happen. But I get that, and I can definitely feel that, and we'll see how that urge wells up in me as we go through this season. But one other thing I wanted to ask you, Kristen.
Yeah,
I know you're committed to voting for Donald Trump against any of the Democratic candidates, and so I was just wondering, especially in light of impeachment and all that, is there anything that Donald Trump could say or do that would make you either vote for a Democratic opponent or just not vote for president in 2020? Is there just, it's just a matter of it just doesn't matter? I mean, I assume.
Oh, no.
I assume that if Donald Trump, a tape came out there were all kinds of, say, racial slurs and things like that, and that might be too much. But I mean, you're not saying that I don't care what he says or what he does.
Oh, no.
It's judges and deregulation matter more than anything else.
Well, I've been asked this question on the show before, and I'm asked this question from time to time. I think that I've made it really clear on this show and to people just in general that I don't really necessarily believe in voting for a person as much as I believe in voting for what they plan to bring about, what they've done, what they're doing, goals. I look towards sort of the end game. What is the end game? And the reason that I've become that way, and I say become because there was a time in my life where I did vote for the person, and those things did matter. I think it's important. I think, generally it's somebody has to, I don't want to say appear presidential, but I think that there are certain leadership qualities and there's a certain amount of maturity that is lacking in President Trump. But ultimately, the reason why I'll be voting for him in 2020 is about the end game and the goals. There are things that are important to me that are priorities for me and my family, and just in terms of our futures that I think are best served under President Trump versus President Biden or President Warren or President Sanders. I don't know, and I'm thinking about it. I'm looking at the left now. I'm sort of picturing them in my head. I don't know that there's a situation where I would vote for a Democrat for president unless it was something so egregious and there was a candidate that was middle of the road enough and had sort of given me reason to believe that they may be working towards some of the same goals
Sure.
that I deem important. Like I know I have somebody in my family who's a staunch Democrat loves to say that he voted for Bush Sr. I think for re-election, actually. I don't think he voted for Bill Clinton. And he kind of lays out the reasons, and a lot of why he voted for him were a lot of the reasons were economic in nature. And I understood it. And I think if I was faced with a similar situation where there was a candidate on, for the other side, for a Democratic candidate who was saying a lot of things that I understood and things that spoke to me and sort of were in line with my goals, I think I would. I don't see that in 2020. I didn't see that in 2016. I don't see it in 2020 happening. I think a more likely scenario, if something was so egregious, if there was something that in my mind rose to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors, or like you said, if this like bombshell tape came out with all these horrific things said about whoever, that just turned my stomach so much that I couldn't vote for Donald Trump, I probably would just not vote for president. And that just seems like it seems like a solution. But again, I haven't seen that yet. But my eyes are open. I'm not, a Republican who's married to the Republican Party and to Donald Trump. I, keep my eyes open. This is what I am, because right now it suits what I think is important and what my goals are. And, my eyes are open. I'm watching him.
Well, that's that. And I of course, well, I'm saying of course, but I knew that. And I just wanted to emphasize that and give you a chance to sort of explain that, because I think there are some people certainly who would say, I don't care what he says, what he does. It's,
I know
Donald Trump all the way. And you're not running around with your MAGA hat and sort of, waving the banner.
And I know people who are the opposite, who say, I will vote against him no matter what he does,
Sure.
So it's just, this is where we are.
Absolutely. This is where we are. And where we also are is at the end of today's show, but there's going to be more. Kristen and I, as soon as we're done with this, we are going to be recording our bonus show just for Patreon supporters. I think today we're going to talk about a story we didn't get a chance to get to, and that's the Israel peace plan. That was the other big news this week. And maybe we'll talk, I don't know if we have time, about that, those resolutions the House passed against use of force, and to withdraw the use of force authorization that's been used for everything since 9/11, basically. So that'll be interesting. And of course, that'll be available to all of our Patreon supporters. And we have a very special quick take this week. Trey actually went to Washington, D.C. and sat in on yesterday's Senate proceedings. And right when they got done, he went outside and recorded in front of the U.S. Capitol. And we have that up there as a quick take for our Patreon supporters. And so definitely you'll want to check that out. And also, if you want to get in touch with us, you know how to do it. The mail@politicsguys.com. There's our bipartisan politics subreddit, which has just been truly great. Thanks everyone who's participated in that. Our Facebook page, facebook.com/politicsguys page. We're on Twitter @politicsguys. And I forgot to mention, of course, if you want to become a Patreon supporter, I'm getting all this out of order, patreon.com/politicsguys. And we would really appreciate it if you could share this episode. If you feel like it's worth sharing, I'd share it for sure, and I will, and we hope you will too. Leave ratings and reviews, and that really helps us get the word out to everyone. The executive producers of the Politics Guys, Bruce Johnson, Wilmer Moreno, Andra Masker, and Daniel Toe. Today's show is produced by Kristen Matheny and Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.